Beneath the Armor, a conversation with author Dr. Bernadette Atanga. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hi, everyone. This is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator. Welcome back to the LMI podcast, where we talk about law and conflict resolution topics to educate professionals and everyday people. Today, we're not going to talk too much about the law, but we're going to focus more on conflict resolution, and we're going to do it through a guest who is a physician, who's a speaker, who's a worldwide traveler, and who's written a book called Beneath the Armor. So, Dr. Bernadette Atanga, how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you, and thank you for having me back.
Yes. Thank you so much for coming back. And of course, people who want to check out your first video can go on the channel. It's on lmipodcast.com as well. And they'll be able to see the last time you were on some months back, where you had told me you were going to be writing a book, or you had finished it, and it was in the publisher's hands, and it's finally out. So I think we promised each other that when you did finally get it out, you were going to come back on, and we're going to talk about some of the points raised. And it's important because it deals specifically with men and conflict in their personal lives, relationship lives, and work lives. And it goes right along with what we do on this channel. But before we start, let's talk about you a little bit. So, Dr. Bernadette Atanga is a physician with over 30 years of experience in internal medicine and pediatrics. She's also a leadership coach, a speaker, and author, and she focuses on the emotional health and empathetic leadership. Empathetic leadership, my apologies. She has a global perspective, having lived in multiple countries, and has led numerous international workshops on emotional mastery and conflict resolution. So, welcome back, and let's dive right into this book. So, let's have you take us back a little bit. Why did you write this book, Beneath the Armor: 8 Practical Strategies for Men to Embrace Vulnerability and Lead with Authentic Strength?
Yes, so like I say, I empower men, successful men, to lead with authentic strength from the boardroom to the family room. And that's because most people are successful in the boardroom, but in the family room, that's where everything, at home, the home life is not intact. And you can have both. You can have a successful home life and a successful professional life. Why men? I actually didn't start with men. Now, most of my career has been predominantly working with men. I worked for the VA, so that's over 90% of my patients were men. And prior to that as well, I was going to Cameroon and doing these workshops with men. So I actually started with women and children. As you mentioned, I'm an internist and a pediatrician. And my work with pediatrics and internal medicine simultaneously made me see how childhood trauma translated into adult illness, whether it's physical illness like addiction, alcoholism, or other kinds of psychiatric issues, or relationship issues, emotional issues. And so when I started going back to Cameroon, it was actually to inform adults the effects of their behavior on children as they grow. And I did my research. I went to schools, I talked to children, they expressed themselves in letters. And when I took this back to adults, and I distinctly remember it was, I think, 2005, it was an annual general meeting of a prestigious boys' school in the city where I grew up. And these were men that are cream of the crop of the society. And as I was telling them the stories about the children, you could hear a pin drop. And then I realized they were not listening to the children's stories. Those stories were giving voice to their own childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was done and I was about to make my dash out, you had this chorus that said, "Where can we find?" And they started asking, how to meet me. They wanted more. Their wives just said, thank you. And you could see in their eyes, it was a thank you for opening this chapter or for giving voice to our suffering. These were women who were old enough to be my mother. And so I could only imagine what their lives had been, and the fact that the men were ready to say, oh, I can see me in what you're saying, but I never understood what that was. Fast forward here, that was just about the time that I started working in the VA. And so I thought this was a problem in another country, but over my almost 20 years at the VA, I saw that pattern over and over. And I started realizing the pattern of men are emotional if you give them the space. And there was a lot of repressed pain, but that's also because our culture made it so. So, and that's why, the recurring theme in the book is it's not your fault.
Hmm.
We did that to you, but we can change that. And I also noticed you would see men in my practice here in the US, you would see people who, as I say, from the boardroom to the family room, they come for their blood pressure, they come for, their diabetes, they come for stress, but they also come with behavior issues, and they would tell you about what is going on at home. And when you dig a little bit deeper, you make the connection to that childhood. But there is room for that. You can help them. And that's what I'm doing now, just coaching these men outside of the clinic now, because most people don't have time to go to the doctors. Most success, they don't have time to go to the doctor. They don't have time to take a break and, find out what's going on. They don't want to go to counseling. And I don't offer counseling by any measure, but I offer coaching, just what I have done for the last 15 years, so that it gives people that pathway to healing.
Yes. So thank you. Why the title Beneath the Armor?
Well, because people are trained to wear an armor. And in this case that we're talking about men, and that armor could be anything. It could be your work, it could be academics, it could be money, it could be your family status, and whatever it is that validates your existence. And when I bring it back to family, you would also realize that's why we say that when we bring this to domestic violence, what's the most dangerous time of a woman's life in a domestic violence situation?
Mm-hmm.
It's when she's about to leave. And that's the time when, it might end up in murder. That has
Yeah.
happened before. And why is because you are taking, the person doesn't see you as a separate entity. You were their armor, their identity. Even if the relationship was not working, but as long as they can step out and they are viewed as this person that has this beautiful family from the outside, they didn't
Yeah.
care how it was going on the inside. So if you're leaving, you're taking their power, you're taking their armor. And so the whole thing is to make people understand underneath that armor, who are you? Because that person underneath the armor is lovable. That person underneath the armor has pain that can be healed. And life can be beautiful if you shed that armor, because that's weight, and be authentic. And you can still be a leader, both in the boardroom and in the family room, with authenticity and with strength.
Mhm. Well, that example you gave about that abusive man who reacts with physical abuse if she tries to leave, it has echoes of codependency, and that people are not being their genuine selves, and this is kind of what you go into, right? 8 practical strategies for men to embrace vulnerability and lead with authentic strength. So authenticity, and also what you talked about when you were in Cameroon and some of the men and how they reacted because they heard you talking to really to them, not just to the children. So I wanted to read a section on page 43, chapter 4, titled Speak for Your Younger Self. So in here you write, it is important to understand that when you are born, you are an empty cup waiting to be filled with love through the touch, love, and care of parents. You learn to build trust and a good sense of self that will in turn serve you in your adult life as you start other relationships. If you were raised in unfortunate circumstances that left you feeling unloved or abused as a child, you may have unconsciously learned not to trust other people and rely on yourself alone. You may become suspicious when people show you unconditional love. You end up perceiving situations differently from what they represent. These circumstances may leave your childhood cup empty of basic positive emotions and instead full of negative emotions that result from injury. It is important to understand that this is just how life happened to you, and that if your cup is empty, you cannot give that which you do not have, and oftentimes do not even know that you lack. So that said a lot to me because I think about some of the cases that I deal with and some of the parents who I see that the decisions that they make, especially around their kids when they're having custody battles, I realize to myself a lot of times they don't realize the trauma that they're passing on to their kids. And so many cases I've walked away with thinking poor kids, right? Because the parents just don't see it. They might be blind to it. And this isn't about picking on men. This is about helping somebody realize it or admit to something that they might not even be aware that is missing from their life. So can you talk a little bit about why you wrote this in terms of a person seeing a person seeing that a lot of the issue that they're going through right now goes back to their childhood.
Yeah, so that, and you just said something that it's not like we're not picking on men. And I would say the title of that book, if you replaced men with women, everything would apply. So, everybody can benefit from that. But since we are talking about men, that's the focus. Yeah, I said you can't give from an empty cup. You have two people born the same day, but depending on their life circumstances, they turn out differently, at least emotionally. And you see that in adult relationships where people don't trust. You would say, yes, you decide to marry this person, you decide to form a family with them, but you're just not able to engage with them in a trusting relationship. And that is because for some people, that lack of trust has been their way to protect themselves through world. So it's not as if they decided to not trust you. It's just that that's the way they've been able to make it through life. It's a safety measure for them.
Yeah.
But that, again, that person may not even know that. They may not realize it because that's what's normal for them. And you did mention the fact that they may not even know how to receive love, because
Yeah.
if that's not the language, they don't know how it's a healthy love is expressed. And it was important for me to include that because if you're part of that equation, whether you're married to somebody like that or in relationship, you are the man in that relationship. A lot of times people don't stop to ask, what's in my cup? What did I get? And the book, I designed this book to be as basic as possible
Yeah.
for the person at the sixth grade level to the person with a PhD. And so I use things that people can visualize. So what's in your cup? What did you get in your cup? So because that's not something you can make up, right?
Yeah.
It is what it is. So you are not a bad person or a good person. You are just a person with a cup that's either empty or void of certain emotions and filled with others that may not be serving you. So it's important to look at what's in your cup. Is this a healthy combination for a relationship? And you can find out. You can talk to people about it. How do I function? How do I come across to other people? Do I have love? Do I have trust?
Mhm.
Do I have empathy? Do I have compassion? Do I have forgiveness? Because those are the elements. Do I have tolerance? Those are the elements of a healthy relationship. But if you come from a place where you have to put people on the defensive. You always have to test people to see if they are worthy of you being with them. So you have to create situations that if it turns into chaos, then you go, aha, I knew it. You
Mhm.
know. But that's just because you create, and some people don't know how to function on the calm. So if you come from a chaotic background and you happen to partner with somebody that does not know chaos, invariably you would create chaos to feel normal.
Hmm. Well, it's a good point. And when does this chaos come out? Is it when there's these triggers? I think the phrase you use in the book is, I guess, subconscious triggers that happen that were never dealt with, right? From issues in the past, trauma from the past, pain from your past that dealt with your childhood, they were never dealt with. Fast forward, something happens in your life, in your everyday life, in business and work and personal relationships, and then you react. And so, how do some of these manifestations come out?
A simple one I can give you is if you talk to people who have been to war, who have experienced war, gunshots, or even people who live in neighborhoods where there is a lot of gunshots.
Yeah,
But I'll take the war veterans, for example. When they come back, because of their PTSD, families, they really have a hard time integrating into families. But
hmm,
one of the simple things, like even just popping a balloon, is a trigger.
yeah,
It takes them right back to that place. So, same thing, the things that may be triggers in a relationship are numerous. But I just give that's a very common example for people to understand where just popping a balloon, that pop, triggers that
yeah,
wartime experience for somebody. And their reaction, even though they know they're not in that war zone, but that trigger is real. And
mm,
their reaction to that trigger is real, even though it's a balloon and not a bomb.
yes. So the way some men react, and in your introduction, you write, some men have been labeled as difficult, angry, or even narcissistic. But in my years as a physician and more than a decade of speaking internationally to men's groups, I heard their pain and saw their tears as men share their stories. I have come to understand that a lot of men are experiencing repressed pain, and this affects their leadership at home or at work. Can you speak a little bit about that and how some things that we might call, for example, narcissistic, is actually something different that where we might be wrong to diagnose a certain way, but it's simply a manifestation of something that happened in the past that hasn't been dealt with.
Yeah, I put that term in there intentionally because it's a term now that is thrown around a lot.
Yeah,
You talk to somebody and they say, "Oh, my partner is narcissistic." And I always want to say, "Who made the diagnosis?"
yeah,
I think and I think I know what they're talking about, but I just want people to be cautious and realize that narcissistic personality disorder is actually a serious condition, and it takes evaluation and diagnosis by a psychiatrist. So let's
mm,
keep that in mind.
yeah,
And so, but with that, it's all over. I don't even know what people mean when they say this person is narcissistic. And when you ask them, they give you all sorts of description. But it comes down to this person is difficult to deal with. I think that's the simple thing. It's difficult to deal with. They are not caring. They only think about themselves. They don't understand what I say, or they don't care if I feel one way or the other. So those things, and then they go Google the word and say, he's narcissistic. And I
exactly. Yeah,
think I put that there especially for the people that are in relationship with this man. And I think it is important that we have to understand people did not just appear, they got to where they are
mm,
with a life story behind them. And so it is important to find out what is your story. Because when you know their story, it might be an explanation to what they've become. Keep in mind, it does not excuse the behavior, it just offers you the opportunity to be compassionate. I focus a lot on just relationships, interpersonal relationships, because that's what I've had experience with.
yeah,
I've had experience with men, successful men, men who are on the outside very strong, whether strength by their position in society, strength by the kind of work they do, and but then on the inside they're very weak and their home life is falling apart. So that's how this book came about. And then when you talk about shame, that's something, when we grow, that's something that people are not taught how to handle, or they shame you whenever something happens bad. And if you think even in the playground,
Mm.
elementary school playground, that word shame is always with things that people would do, or you do something that people make you feel ashamed, that makes you want to hide,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
You don't, yeah. Or so that also comes into adulthood, where something may happen to you and you feel shame and you can't talk about it. And a simple thing as, I would say, if you met someone who is grieving, and most often if they tell somebody that, oh, my loved one passed away, and they say, what did they die from? You say cancer. Most often that's met with compassion. Oh, I'm
Mm.
so sorry for your loss. If you say suicide,
Mm.
it's a pause and silence.
Mm.
And that makes, because people react to that negatively, it makes you not want to tell, because there is shame attached to it. So whether it is
Mm.
suicide or it's addiction or things like that. So I just give that as an example of things
Yeah.
that we all do, we encounter, but we don't realize that our reaction puts people in a position of shame. And
Mm.
so it's the same thing when you look at adults. The reason I wrote that chapter is because there are things that happen in people's lives or family lives that they don't want to address, because they think, if you, this brings me shame. And or a simple thing like poverty. You have a very successful person, they make seven figures now, and they live this life of luxury, but then they don't want anybody to know the poverty that they grew up with, right? So since we're talking about men, you
Yeah.
get, yeah, and you live that life of, so you just want people to know this you, but that child is in you, and that's a child that is living in fear that they may be discovered. You don't want that poor child to be discovered, but people don't realize that that whole story makes you who you are, and that child is lovable, because it's no easy feat to come from that level of poverty into this amount of wealth. It takes hard work, it takes grit. So those are values that when you embrace, and people will not see those values in you if they cannot make the connection to see how
Mm.
hard you had to work. And then that makes you even look a better success story than
Yeah.
what you are. So, the issue of shame, many things can bring about shame. So that armor that people carry, underneath that armor can be shame. But vulnerability is, and that's why I say being vulnerable, to take the time to understand that, makes you stronger. It doesn't make you weak. And to connect that emotion, and I coach on that, how you can do that. It makes you a better leader because you're more authentic.
So can you compare or contrast vulnerability from weakness?
I'm sorry.
Vulnerability versus weakness, because I think people put weakness as a negative, right? But is vulnerability and weakness the same things in your mind, or are they different?
No, because in fact, it's people are afraid to be vulnerable because they think it makes them look weak.
Yeah.
And in men's case, every culture, and I cannot say this enough to men, it's not your fault if you don't want to appear as weak. Because from when you were a little boy, I don't care what culture you come from, what ethnic group you come from, you were told as a child not to show emotions.
Yep.
And that started when because as a child, you were born to show emotions. Our first expression was to cry. When you hurt, you told people, and they would put a band aid. They put a band aid, and then we decide at a certain age that you need to toughen up. And then when you express the same human emotion that you're used to expressing, they will tell you, toughen up. You're a boy. You are not a girl, because then girls are allowed to be weak, but a man should not be. And I think as a culture, we need to revisit that, because we cannot be accusing people of being aggressive and not being vulnerable and not wanting to pass as weak, when we actually created that culture and
Yeah.
molded them in that form. And then now we have the consequences of their behavior And we're like, oh no, you need to be different,
Yep.
when we
Exactly.
actually raise them a certain way. So I think we need to revisit that as a culture. I mean, maybe there was a time when it made sense, in the times where we were hunter gatherers, you know, you had to decide who was going to be stronger, you or the wild animal. You had to hunt. So it might have made sense then. I can only assume, I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm assuming there was a time when it was survival of the fittest and
Mm.
the men had to be strong to go out and do what they had to do for their families. We are not that same community, we're not that same society, and we cannot be imposing behaviors on people that does not is not conducive to modern day life.
Yes, and I think it was in chapter one where you talk about crying. I think you gave the example of the young boy at a funeral, who was told to toughen up, and or exemplified as, because he's not crying. Well, look, it shows us how strong he is. And later on, when it comes out, the boy had was just holding it all in, and it was a very unnatural and unhealthy, way of trying to make him suppress it all. But he needs to, release it and not, quote unquote, be tough just for the sake of trying to keep societal norms. So thank you for writing, that. But how do you think that the inability for people to cry or be vulnerable, how do you think that that spills over into some of the conflicts that we have in our day to day?
Well, it's not that people are not able to cry. We just tell them they shouldn't, but they do cry. Men do cry. I just had a talk where I gave a keynote at NAMI, Michigan, and I asked the room, "How do men cry?" And they were just spitting it out. Sex, aggression, addiction. It came. So they do cry. The
Mm.
question is, are we going to create space for people to cry in a healthy way, or we're going to make it that they have to suppress it and it comes out in an unhealthy way? Because that pressure is going to come out.
Yeah.
And if you just think about it, if you come out and you, as a physician, maybe a patient just passes, and you tell the wife, the husband just passed, what do you think the reaction of that woman is going to be, learning that their loved one just passed? It's going to be a natural emotion of maybe a breakdown, tears, but there is no shame or withholding that emotion in that manner. If you come out and tell a man your wife just passed, he has the same emotion like the woman, but the first thing in his mind is, I cannot cry, I have to hold it in.
Mm.
And he's going to hold that in. And not that is, I have to hold it in here in front of the doctor. Let me wait until I go to my car. It is, I have to hold it in. And if they don't get healthy intervention, there is no telling, what is going to happen after that. And it's not that every emotion that you hold in ends up in a very terrible act at the end. We're talking about your blood pressure. We're talking about just taking care of yourself. We're talking about inability to sleep, and then other things, and then it spills over into your work. So having that healthy emotion, or being able to handle negative situations in a healthy way, is very important. And for most people, they did not learn that. You do what you do, what you know, you do what you do with what you have, and that's what you were taught. So it's very important for people, as successful as they may be, in reading this book, you think, where am I? And to seek the help that, professionals like me are providing. Because every time when I've given that breakthrough to a man, you see, they say, thank you.
Yes.
They say, thank
Well,
you.
Dr. Ortega, thank you, for coming on. And there's so much more we could talk about: the intergenerational trauma chapter, forgiveness chapter, infertility chapter,
There's,
and how it impacts men. I mean, there's so much jam packed in here. And so, if people want the book, what's the best way they can get it?
they can go to my website or go on Amazon. And then, so on Amazon or my website, if you want to purchase in bulk or if you want a signed copy, I would recommend they go to my website, which is atangamd.com, and send me that information and we can arrange for that because most people like signed copies. In fact, I just mailed a box yesterday of signed copies. So,
Yes.
yeah, but you can get it. And the ebook you can get on Amazon. The paperback you can get on Amazon as well, or through my website. If you want signed copies, you send us a message on the website.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Bernadette Atanga, thank you so much for coming back on the LMI podcast to talk about Beneath the Armor, 8 practical strategies for men to embrace vulnerability and lead with authentic strength. I appreciate it again. So I got my copy, and people should go out there and get it and talk and learn about this topic because it's something that we brush under the rug way too much, and it manifests itself in many toxic ways in our society, whether it's the divorces I handle, custody battles I handle, or the crimes you see out in the streets. It all connects back to our past and what we can do to address it.
And I may also say for men, I have the Beneath the Armor Facebook group. It's a
Okay.
community I'm creating. So it's also a space for men to share experiences. So they can go on Facebook and request to join the
Yes.
Beneath the Armor Facebook group and also follow my Facebook group, which is Bernadette Atanga, MD. And
Yes.
then also they can follow me on LinkedIn and also on
All those links.
Instagram.
I'll put all those links on your page because I do create a blog post for this video. And I appreciate that Facebook group. In fact, after every chapter, you have a section of reflection where people will literally write down, you ask questions, right, from the reader to, it's almost like therapeutic. So I appreciate that.
I know how to take care of my men. Because I 30 years of experience, I
Yeah.
figure out they don't want to go to therapy. You know how long it takes for me to refer somebody to, to talk to somebody, but I figure out certain things that they want to get started.
Yeah.
And so I designed the book with men in mind from the cover to the content to make it's something that they can sit for coffee and they read it cover to cover.
Yeah. But it's a book for women as well, right? Would you say?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I say if you remove men and replace it with women,
Yeah.
everything is going to apply. And the other thing, and I do say that in the book, it's for everybody, even adult children, because it helps you understand the person in your life.
Correct. Yeah.
So it is important for everybody to read that. And I've gotten that feedback from women as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, people going through divorce or separation, I think, would find a lot of value in this, especially if they want to also break the generational cycles that they don't want to see pass on to the next, child, the next set of boys.
Yeah.
All right.
That's the point that if they read it before you make that crucial decision, it informs you and it helps the decisions you make, especially when children are involved.
It's exactly. All right, Dr. Atanga, thank you so much.
Thank
And
you
if,
so much for having me back.
yes, absolutely. Everyone check this video out and all the other ones on lmipodcast.com and of course on the YouTube channel, LMI Podcast. All right, everyone, take care.